The innocent witness. The morning sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Viktor Antonov stepped out of his black armored vehicle and walked toward the towering glass building that served as the headquarters of his empire. To the outside world, this was the main office of Antonov International Holdings, a legitimate business conglomerate that dealt in real estate, shipping, and international trade. But to those who truly understood the shadows that lurked beneath the polished surface of high society, this building represented something far more dangerous and powerful. Viktor Antonov was not merely a businessman with deep pockets and influential connections. He was the head of one of the most feared crime families in the eastern region, a man whose name alone could silence a room full of hardened criminals, and whose reputation had been built upon decades of ruthless efficiency and an almost supernatural ability to know everything that happened within his territory. As Victor walked through the marble lobby, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the polished floor with each measured step, his security team flanked him on both sides like silent shadows. The receptionist behind the massive oak desk immediately stood up straighter, her hands trembling slightly as she offered a respectful nod that Victor acknowledged with nothing more than a slight movement of his eyes. This was his kingdom, and everyone within these walls understood that their lives depended upon his satisfaction with their performance. He had built this empire from nothing, starting as a young man with empty pockets and a heart full of rage against a world that had taken everything from him. Now at 53 years old, with silver streaking through his dark hair and lines of hard experience carved into his face, Viktor Antonov answered to no one and feared nothing. Or so he believed on that particular morning that would change everything he thought he knew about trust and betrayal. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, as it always was. His security chief, a massive man named Sergei who had served the Antonov family for over 20 years, stood beside him with the alert stillness of a predator ready to strike at the first sign of danger. Victor appreciated Sergei's loyalty, though he would never express such sentiment aloud. In his world, showing too much appreciation for anyone could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness was a luxury that men in his position simply could not afford. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the executive floor where Victor's private office occupied the entire northern corner of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, a constant reminder of all that he controlled and all that remained within his reach. As Victor entered the reception area outside his office, he noticed something unusual that immediately captured his attention and caused him to slow his purposeful stride. Sitting on one of the leather chairs reserved for important visitors was a small child, perhaps no more than 3 years old, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit and watching Victor with large, curious eyes that held none of the fear that most people displayed when they found themselves in his presence. The boy had curly dark hair that fell across his forehead in messy waves, and his clothes, while clean and neat, were clearly inexpensive and showed signs of careful mending. Victor stopped completely, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand why there would be a toddler sitting alone in the most dangerous office building in the city. Before Victor could demand an explanation, a door to his left opened quickly and a woman rushed out, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear. Victor recognized her immediately as Alina, the cleaning woman who had worked in his personal office for the past 8 months. She was a quiet, hardworking woman in her late 20s, with tired eyes that spoke of difficult circumstances and hands that were rough from years of physical labor. Victor had approved her hiring personally after his head of household staff had presented her background check and confirmed that she had no connections to any rival organizations or law enforcement agencies. She was simply a single mother trying to survive in a harsh world, exactly the kind of person who would be grateful for steady employment and would never risk losing it by asking too many questions or speaking about what she might see or hear while cleaning rooms where powerful men conducted their business. Alina dropped to her knees in front of Victor, her entire body shaking as words tumbled out of her mouth in a desperate stream of apology and explanation. She explained that her regular childcare arrangements had fallen through unexpectedly that morning when her elderly neighbor who usually watched her son had been taken to the hospital with chest pains. She had no family in the city, no friends she could call upon at such short notice, and she had been terrified of calling in sick because she could not afford to lose even a single day of pay. Her rent was due at the end of the week, and without her full paycheck, she and her son would be facing eviction from their small apartment. She had made a terrible decision to bring the child with her, hiding him in the staff break room with strict instructions to stay quiet and not move from his chair. She had thought that if she could just finish her morning cleaning duties quickly, she could slip away before anyone of importance noticed her son's presence. Victor stood there in silence for a long moment, looking down at the woman who trembled before him like a leaf caught in a violent storm. His security team had tensed immediately, their hands moving toward concealed weapons as they assessed this unexpected breach of protocol and tried to determine if it represented any kind of threat to their employer. The child continued to stare at Victor with innocent curiosity, seemingly unaware that his mother was experiencing the most terrifying moment of her life, or that the tall man with the cold eyes had the power to destroy their lives with a single word. Something in Victor's chest shifted slightly as he watched the scene unfold before him, something that reminded him of a time long ago when he had been just as vulnerable and desperate, when he had known what it felt like to have nothing but fear and determination as his companions. To the shock of everyone present, including his own security team who had served him for years and thought they understood his character completely, Victor reached down and offered his hand to Alina, helping her rise to her feet. His voice when he spoke was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of absolute authority that no one in the room would dare to question. He told Alina that she would not be punished for bringing her child to work, but that she should have come to the household manager and explained her situation rather than trying to hide it. He had a reputation for being ruthless and unforgiving, and that reputation was well earned, but he had never in his life punished someone for trying to protect their child. He understood desperation better than most people would ever know, and he recognized the fierce protective love of a parent who would risk everything, including their own life, to keep their child safe and provided for. Alina's eyes filled with tears of relief as she thanked Victor repeatedly, promising that it would never happen again and swearing her eternal gratitude and loyalty. Victor dismissed her thanks with a wave of his hand, already turning his attention to the more pressing matters of his day. He had an extremely important meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning, a gathering of his most trusted lieutenants to discuss a matter of critical importance to the organization. There had been whispers of a traitor within his inner circle, someone who had been passing information to a rival family that had been making aggressive moves into Victor's territory over the past several months. 3 shipments had been intercepted, 2 safe houses had been raided, and one of his most valuable contacts within the police department had been arrested and was now facing pressure to testify against the organization. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, and Victor knew with cold certainty that someone close to him had betrayed his trust in the most unforgivable way possible. As Victor entered his private office and settled into the leather chair behind his massive mahogany desk, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the space that represented everything he had achieved. The walls were lined with rare books and expensive artwork, carefully chosen to project an image of culture and sophistication that contrasted sharply with the violent nature of his true business. A crystal decanter of aged whiskey sat on a silver tray near the window, catching the morning light and casting small rainbows across the polished surface of a nearby table. Behind his desk, hidden within a panel that appeared to be nothing more than decorative woodwork, was a safe containing documents and objects that could destroy powerful men and shift the balance of power throughout the entire criminal underworld. This office was Victor's sanctuary, the one place where he allowed himself to feel something other than the constant vigilance that had kept him alive for so many dangerous years. The hours passed quickly as Victor prepared for his meeting, reviewing reports and intelligence gathered by his network of informants and analysts. The list of potential traitors was short but deeply troubling, consisting entirely of men who had served him for many years and had earned positions of trust and authority within the organization. There was Dmitri, his financial advisor, who handled the complex task of laundering millions of dollars through legitimate business operations. There was Nikolai, his head of security operations, who oversaw protection details and the enforcement of Victor's will throughout the territory. There was also Roman, his oldest friend and the man who had stood beside him during the bloody early years when Victor had been fighting to establish himself against older, more established powers who had dismissed him as nothing more than an ambitious young fool. The thought that any of these men could have betrayed him filled Victor with a cold rage that he kept carefully hidden behind his composed exterior. At precisely 10 o'clock, the men began arriving for the meeting, each one passing through multiple security checkpoints before being admitted to Victor's office. They took their seats around a long conference table that had been set up near the windows, their faces displaying various degrees of tension and concern as they understood that this was no ordinary meeting. Victor had summoned them with specific instructions that no phones or recording devices would be permitted, and that anything discussed within these walls would be treated with the highest level of confidentiality. As Victor surveyed the faces of his most trusted advisors, he searched for any sign of guilt or nervousness that might reveal the identity of the traitor who had been systematically destroying everything he had built. The meeting had been underway for approximately 45 minutes when Victor noticed movement near the door of his office. To his great surprise, he saw that Alina's young son had somehow wandered away from wherever his mother had left him and had found his way into the most restricted room in the entire building. The child moved quietly, his small feet making almost no sound on the thick carpet as he walked along the wall, seemingly fascinated by the artwork and decorations that lined the space. Victor's lieutenants had not yet noticed the boy, too focused on the heated discussion about security protocols and counterintelligence measures that had dominated the meeting thus far. Victor should have immediately summoned security to remove the child and should have been furious that such a breach had occurred during a meeting of this importance. But something made him hesitate, some instinct that told him to wait and watch. The boy wandered closer to Victor's desk, his curious eyes examining everything within reach with the innocent fascination that only young children possess. Victor watched him from the corner of his eye, continuing to listen to his lieutenants debate possible suspects and strategies while simultaneously tracking the child's movements through his office. The boy clutched his worn stuffed rabbit tightly against his chest as he explored, occasionally reaching out to touch something that caught his attention before quickly pulling his hand back, as if remembering instructions from his mother to look but not touch. There was something endearing about the child's careful curiosity, something that reminded Victor of a gentler part of himself that he had believed was long dead and buried beneath years of violence and hard decisions. Then suddenly, the child stopped beside Victor's desk and dropped to his knees, peering underneath the massive piece of furniture with an expression of intense concentration. Victor felt his attention sharpen as he watched the boy's face change from curiosity to something that looked almost like concern. The meeting discussion faded into background noise as Victor focused entirely on the small figure kneeling beside his desk, wondering what could possibly have captured the child's attention so completely. The boy looked up at Victor with those large, innocent eyes, and what happened next would change everything. The child tugged gently on Victor's sleeve, his small fingers barely able to grasp the expensive fabric of the suit jacket. When Victor leaned down, bringing his ear closer to the boy's level, the child whispered words that seemed to freeze time itself within the room. The boy said that there was something under the desk, something that looked strange and scary, and that Victor should look at it because it had a blinking red light like his mother's phone but different. Victor's blood ran cold as the implications of the child's words penetrated his consciousness and triggered alarms that had been developed through decades of surviving in a world where death could come at any moment from any direction. Without changing his expression or showing any outward sign of alarm that might warn a potential enemy, Victor slowly pushed his chair back and lowered himself to look beneath his desk. What he saw there made his heart stop for one terrible moment before rage, unlike anything he had experienced in years, began to build within his chest. Attached to the underside of his desk, hidden in a spot that would be invisible to anyone sitting in his chair, was a sophisticated surveillance device that combined audio recording capabilities with what appeared to be a small explosive charge. The blinking red light that the child had noticed indicated that the device was active, which meant that everything discussed in this room had been transmitted to whoever had planted this abomination in Victor's most private sanctuary. Victor straightened slowly, his face now wearing the cold mask of controlled fury that had made grown men weep and beg for mercy throughout his long career. The room fell silent as his lieutenants recognized the danger signals in their leader's expression and posture. Victor's eyes moved systematically from face to face around the table, searching for any flicker of guilt or fear that might betray the traitor who had planted this device in his office. Someone in this room had accessed his private sanctuary, had violated the trust that Victor extended only to his innermost circle, and had placed not only a listening device but an explosive that could have killed him at any moment the traitor chose to trigger it. The betrayal was complete, absolute, and unforgivable. The child remained beside Victor's desk, seemingly unaware of the deadly tension that now filled the room like poison gas seeping through the air. Alina appeared in the doorway, her face draining of all color as she realized that her son had somehow escaped her supervision and had wandered into the middle of what was clearly an extremely dangerous situation. She started to rush forward to retrieve her child, apologies already forming on her lips, but Victor held up one hand in a gesture that stopped her immediately. He looked down at the small boy who had accidentally uncovered a secret that someone had desperately tried to keep hidden, and Victor realized that this innocent child had just saved his life in a way that none of his highly trained security personnel had been able to do. Victor placed his hand gently on the boy's head, a gesture of gratitude that shocked everyone in the room who had never seen their feared leader show such softness to anyone. He told Alina that her son was very brave and very smart, and that she should take him somewhere safe immediately because the next few hours were going to be very unpleasant for some people in this building. Alina rushed forward and scooped up her child, holding him tightly against her chest as she backed toward the door, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion about what was happening. The boy waved goodbye to Victor over his mother's shoulder, still clutching his stuffed rabbit, completely unaware that his innocent observation had just triggered a storm that would shake the foundations of the criminal underworld. As the door closed behind Alina and her son, Victor turned back to face his lieutenants with eyes that burned with cold fire. He informed them that no one would be leaving this room until he discovered who had planted the device beneath his desk, and that the person responsible should understand that what came next would make them wish they had never been born. The men around the table exchanged nervous glances, each one suddenly aware that they were trapped in a room with a predator who had just discovered that one of them had tried to have him killed. The investigation that followed would reveal secrets that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined, and the consequences would reshape everything Victor thought he knew about loyalty, trust, and the true meaning of family. But Victor did not yet know the full extent of the betrayal that awaited him, or that the person responsible for planting the device was not who he suspected. The truth, when it finally emerged, would shatter relationships he had believed were unbreakable and force him to question every decision he had made over the past several years. And at the center of it all, unknowingly, was the small boy with the curious eyes and the worn stuffed rabbit, whose innocent words had set in motion events that would change multiple lives forever. The hunt for the traitor had begun, but Victor was about to learn that some enemies hide in plain sight, wearing the faces of those we trust most deeply. And some secrets, once uncovered, can never be buried again, no matter how desperately we might wish to forget what we have learned about the people we love. The tension in Victor's office had become almost unbearable as the hours stretched on, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the city skyline in shades of orange and red that seemed to mirror the bloody reckoning that everyone in the room knew was coming. Victor had ordered the building locked down immediately after discovering the device beneath his desk, and his security teams had taken up positions at every exit to ensure that no one could enter or leave without his explicit permission. The 5 men seated around the conference table had been forced to surrender their phones and weapons, and each of them had been subjected to a thorough search that had revealed nothing incriminating, but had done little to calm the atmosphere of suspicion and fear that hung over the gathering like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury. Victor had spent the past several hours conducting individual interrogations with each of his lieutenants, pressing them with questions about their recent activities, their access to his office, and any unusual behavior they might have observed in their colleagues. The device had been carefully removed and analyzed by his technical specialists, who had determined that it was sophisticated military-grade equipment that would have required significant resources and expertise to obtain. The explosive component, though small, had been powerful enough to kill anyone sitting at the desk when triggered, and the listening device had been transmitting to an encrypted channel that would take considerable time and effort to trace back to its source. Someone had invested substantial money and planning into this assassination attempt, which meant that the traitor was not acting alone but had powerful backing from an outside force that wanted Victor dead. As the interrogations progressed, Victor found himself no closer to identifying the guilty party than he had been at the beginning. Each of his lieutenants had provided alibis and explanations that were difficult to verify but impossible to definitively disprove. Dmitri, the financial advisor, claimed that he had not been in Victor's office for over 2 weeks and pointed out that his expertise was in numbers and money, not in explosive devices or surveillance equipment. Nikolai, the security chief, acknowledged that he had regular access to Victor's office as part of his duties, but argued that if he wanted Victor dead, he could have accomplished it far more easily through dozens of other methods that would not have left any evidence. Roman, Victor's oldest friend, simply sat in wounded silence, his eyes reflecting deep hurt that Victor would even consider him capable of such betrayal after everything they had survived together over the decades. What troubled Victor most was the timing of the device's discovery, which seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. The boy had wandered into the meeting at precisely the moment when the discussion had turned to the subject of identifying the traitor, and his innocent observation had interrupted what might have been the traitor's opportunity to gauge how close Victor was getting to discovering their identity. Victor found himself wondering if the child's presence had been somehow arranged, if Alina herself might be part of a larger conspiracy that extended far beyond his inner circle. The thought filled him with a different kind of dread, because if even a simple cleaning woman could be turned against him, then no one in his organization could be trusted, and he would be forced to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder at every shadow and questioning every interaction. While Victor conducted his investigation in the main office, Alina sat in a small break room on a lower floor, holding her son tightly and trying to process what had happened during the brief moments when the boy had been in the powerful man's office. She had seen the look on Victor's face when he had looked beneath his desk, had recognized the cold fury that had transformed his features into something terrifying and inhuman. She had also seen the gentleness with which he had touched her son's head before sending them away, a contradiction that she could not reconcile with everything she had heard about the ruthless crime lord who employed her. Her son, Misha, seemed unaffected by the drama that swirled around them, more interested in making his stuffed rabbit dance across the table than in understanding why his mother's hands were shaking and why there were armed men standing guard outside the door. As the evening wore on and the investigation continued without progress, Victor received a call from one of his contacts within the police department that changed everything he thought he understood about the threat he was facing. The contact informed him that the rival family that had been moving against him over the past several months was not acting independently, as Victor had assumed, but was receiving support and intelligence from someone within law enforcement who had a personal vendetta against the Antonov organization. This person had been carefully feeding information to Victor's enemies, orchestrating the interceptions and raids that had cost him so much, and had apparently decided that the time had come to eliminate Victor himself by planting the device that the child had discovered. The contact did not know the identity of this law enforcement insider, but he had managed to obtain a partial phone number that had been used to coordinate with the rival family, a number that ended in the digit 749. Victor sat alone in his office after receiving this information, staring at the city lights that had begun to twinkle in the gathering darkness, while his mind worked through the implications of what he had learned. The involvement of law enforcement added a new dimension to the betrayal, suggesting that someone within his organization had been cooperating with the authorities rather than simply selling information to a competing criminal enterprise. This kind of cooperation would require a specific motivation, something beyond mere greed or ambition that would compel a trusted member of his inner circle to work with the very forces that sought to destroy everything Victor had built. He began to review the personal histories of his lieutenants with fresh eyes, searching for any connection to law enforcement that might explain the betrayal. It was nearly midnight when Victor's security team brought him a discovery that sent shockwaves through his entire understanding of the situation. While conducting a routine search of the staff areas as part of the lockdown procedures, they had found a hidden compartment in Alina's locker that contained several items that did not belong to a simple cleaning woman. There was a sophisticated encrypted phone, similar to the ones used by undercover operatives and intelligence agents. There were documents that appeared to be surveillance reports on Victor's activities and schedules, written in a professional format that suggested law enforcement training. And most damning of all, there was a photograph of Alina standing beside a man in a police uniform, both of them smiling at the camera with the easy familiarity of close family members. Victor summoned Alina to his office immediately, his heart heavy with the weight of betrayal even as his mind refused to accept what the evidence seemed to indicate. The woman who entered his office looked exhausted and afraid, her son sleeping in her arms with the peaceful innocence of a child who trusted that the adults around him would keep him safe. Victor gestured for her to sit down and asked his security team to leave the room, a request that surprised them but that they obeyed without question. He needed to conduct this conversation privately, needed to understand the full truth before deciding how to respond to what appeared to be the most elaborate deception he had ever encountered. Alina's face crumbled when Victor placed the items from her locker on the desk between them, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as she realized that her carefully constructed cover had been completely destroyed. She did not try to deny what the evidence clearly showed, did not offer excuses or attempt to negotiate for her life. Instead, she began to speak in a quiet voice that carried the weight of profound exhaustion and resignation, telling a story that Victor had never expected to hear, and that would force him to reconsider everything he believed about justice, vengeance, and the terrible choices that people make when they are driven by love and desperation. Alina explained that the man in the photograph was her brother, Alexei, a police detective who had dedicated his life to bringing down organized crime in the city. 3 years ago, Alexei had been investigating a case that had led him dangerously close to exposing one of the Antonov organization's most profitable operations, and he had been ambushed by men who worked for Victor's rivals, but who had been protecting shared interests that benefited multiple criminal enterprises. Alexei had survived the attack, but he had been paralyzed from the waist down and had been forced to retire from active duty, his career and his dreams destroyed by violence that he believed Victor had either ordered or condoned. He had spent the past 3 years consumed by hatred and the desire for revenge, and he had eventually convinced Alina to help him by going undercover within Victor's household to gather intelligence that could be used to destroy the Antonov Empire. Victor listened in silence as Alina described how she had been reluctant at first, frightened of the danger and uncertain about participating in activities that could be considered illegal even if they were directed against a criminal organization. But Alexei had been relentless in his arguments, reminding her of how their family had been destroyed by violence, how their mother had died of grief after seeing her son confined to a wheelchair, how justice had never been served for the men who had taken everything from them. Alina had eventually agreed to help, had obtained employment in Victor's household through careful manipulation of the hiring process, and had spent months gathering information while pretending to be nothing more than a humble cleaning woman grateful for steady work. She had planted the surveillance devices throughout the building at her brother's direction, had reported on Victor's meetings and movements, and had helped coordinate the attacks that had been slowly dismantling his organization. But everything had changed when her son had discovered the device beneath Victor's desk. Alina continued, her voice breaking with emotion as she looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. She had not known about the explosive component, had been told by her brother that the devices were purely for surveillance and would never be used to harm anyone. When she had seen Victor's face in the office and had understood that she had been helping to place a bomb beneath the desk of a man who had shown her nothing but unexpected kindness, she had been overwhelmed by guilt and horror at what she had become part of. She had spent the hours since the discovery wrestling with her conscience, trying to decide whether to reveal the truth or to maintain her silence and hope that she could somehow protect her son from the consequences of her choices. Victor sat in stillness for a long moment after Alina finished speaking, processing the information she had provided and weighing it against everything he knew about human nature and the complex motivations that drove people to do terrible things. He thought about the brother confined to a wheelchair, burning with hatred and dreaming of revenge. He thought about the sister who loved her brother enough to risk her life and her child's future to help him achieve his goals. He thought about the men who had attacked Alexei 3 years ago, men who had been acting on orders that Victor had known nothing about but who had been part of the broader ecosystem of violence that he had helped create and sustain throughout his career. And he thought about the small boy sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, the innocent child whose curious nature had inadvertently saved Victor's life and had now placed his mother's life in Victor's hands. The truth, Victor realized, was far more complicated than he had initially believed. The traitor was not one of his trusted lieutenants, but was instead a grief-stricken woman who had been manipulated by her brother's desire for revenge. The device that could have killed him had been planted not by a calculating enemy seeking power or profit, but by a family seeking justice for wounds that Victor's world had inflicted upon them, even if he had not been directly responsible for the specific attack that had destroyed their lives. He found himself facing a choice that seemed impossible, a decision that would reveal something fundamental about the kind of man he truly was beneath the reputation and the fear and the decades of violence that had built his empire. Victor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that slept beneath him, millions of lives unfolding in the darkness with no knowledge of the drama that was playing out in this room high above the streets. He thought about his own past, about the circumstances that had turned him from a young man with nothing into the feared crime lord he had become. He remembered the violence that had claimed his own parents, the desperation that had driven him to make choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but that had set him on a path leading inevitably to this moment. He wondered if he had ever truly understood the cost of the life he had chosen, or if he had simply been too focused on survival and success to recognize the suffering that spread outward from his actions like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. When Victor turned back to face Alina, his decision had been made, though it would surprise everyone who thought they understood the kind of man he was. He told Alina that he would not harm her or her son, and that he would not seek revenge against her brother despite the attempted assassination. Instead, he would make a different choice, one that went against everything his reputation suggested and everything his lieutenants would expect. He would let them go, would provide them with enough money to start a new life somewhere far from the city, and would ask for only one thing in return: that Alina tell her brother what had happened in this room, tell him that Viktor Antonov had chosen mercy over vengeance when he had every right and every reason to choose differently. Alina stared at Victor with an expression of total disbelief, unable to comprehend that she was being offered not just her life but her freedom, and a chance to escape the web of violence and revenge that had entrapped her family for years. She asked why, her voice barely a whisper, needing to understand what could possibly motivate such unexpected mercy from a man whose reputation was built on ruthless efficiency and the absolute punishment of anyone who dared to betray him. Victor's answer surprised even himself as the words left his lips, revealing truths about his own heart that he had kept hidden for so many years that he had almost forgotten they existed. He explained that her son had saved his life today through nothing more than innocent curiosity and a willingness to share what he had observed. The child had shown him something that Victor had almost forgotten was possible in his world: trust without calculation, honesty without manipulation, kindness without expectation of reward. In the moment when the boy had tugged on his sleeve and whispered his warning, Victor had felt something shift inside him, something that had been frozen for decades beginning to thaw. The child had reminded him that there was still innocence in the world, still goodness that existed outside the cycles of violence and revenge that had defined his entire adult life. Killing the boy's mother would mean destroying that innocence, would mean teaching the child that the world was nothing but cruelty and pain, and Victor found that he could not bring himself to be the person who delivered that lesson. But there was more to his decision than just the child's influence. Victor continued, his voice growing quieter as he shared thoughts that he had never spoken aloud to anyone. He told Alina about his own mother, a gentle woman who had believed in kindness and forgiveness even when surrounded by violence, who had taught him that true strength was not measured by the ability to destroy enemies, but by the courage to choose a different path when destruction seemed like the only option. His mother had been killed by men who saw her gentleness as weakness, and Victor had spent his entire life proving that he was not weak, building a reputation for ruthlessness that had kept him alive and powerful for decades. But somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with the part of himself that remembered her lessons, had forgotten that there might be strength in mercy as well as in violence. Alina wept as she listened, recognizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment of transformation that seemed impossible given everything she knew about the man standing before her. She thanked Victor with words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he was offering, promised that she would deliver his message to her brother, and would spend the rest of her life trying to be worthy of the second chance she had been given. Her son stirred in her arms, awakened perhaps by the emotion in his mother's voice, and looked up at Victor with those same curious eyes that had changed everything earlier that day. The boy smiled and waved, a simple gesture of friendliness from a child who did not understand the complexities of the adult world but who recognized kindness when he encountered it. Victor arranged for Alina and her son to be taken to a safe location that night, providing her with documents and money that would allow them to disappear completely and start fresh somewhere far from the reach of both criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies. As he watched them leave his office, the small boy looking back over his mother's shoulder and waving goodbye, Victor felt something crack open inside his chest, releasing emotions that he had suppressed for so long that he had forgotten they existed. For the first time in decades, Victor Antonov found himself crying, tears running down his face as he mourned not just his lost innocence, but all the choices he had made that had led him to become a man who inspired fear rather than love. The dawn was breaking over the city when Victor finally emerged from his office to address his waiting lieutenants, who had spent the long night in anxious uncertainty about the outcome of the investigation and their own fates. He told them a partial truth, explaining that the traitor had been identified and dealt with, that the threat had been neutralized, and that the organization would need to implement new security protocols to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. He did not tell them about Alina or her brother, did not reveal that he had chosen mercy over vengeance, knowing that such information would be seen as weakness that could undermine his authority. Some transformations, he understood, needed to happen quietly, invisibly, without announcement or explanation. In the weeks that followed, Victor began making changes to his operations that surprised and confused his lieutenants, but that seemed to bring unexpected benefits to the organization. He ordered a reduction in the most violent aspects of their business, redirecting resources toward legitimate enterprises that could provide sustainable income without requiring the constant bloodshed that had characterized their previous approach. He established educational scholarships for children from poor neighborhoods, anonymous donations that would give young people opportunities that might keep them from being forced into the criminal life that had claimed Victor himself. And he began quietly searching for information about the men who had attacked Alina's brother 3 years ago, determined to deliver them to justice through his own methods, not out of revenge, but out of a newfound commitment to accountability for the suffering his world had caused. Alina kept her promise, delivering Victor's message to her brother Alexei and watching as the detective struggled to comprehend that his sworn enemy had shown mercy when he had every right to show none. Alexei's initial reaction was suspicion and disbelief, convinced that this must be some kind of elaborate trap or manipulation. But as the weeks passed and no retaliation came, as Alina and Misha remained safe and unthreatened, Alexei began to reconsider everything he thought he knew about Victor Antonov, and about the nature of good and evil in a world where the lines between them were rarely as clear as he had believed. The hatred that had consumed him for 3 years began slowly to fade, replaced by confusion and eventually by something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness, not for the organization that had taken so much from him, but for the man who had chosen not to take anything more. Years later, when Victor Antonov finally retired from his position at the head of the organization, passing control to a successor who had been carefully groomed to continue the shift toward legitimate business operations, he would sometimes think about the small boy with the curious eyes and the worn stuffed rabbit who had changed the course of his life with a few whispered words. He would wonder what had happened to Alina and her son, whether they had found the peaceful life they deserved somewhere far from the shadows that Victor had inhabited for so long. He would hope that Misha had grown into a man who understood that even in the darkest places, kindness could survive and even flourish if someone was willing to nurture it. And sometimes, in his quiet moments of reflection, Victor would remember his mother's voice teaching him that true strength was found not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to create something better, to choose a different path when destruction seemed like the only option. He had spent most of his life forgetting that lesson, but a child's innocent whisper had helped him remember it just in time, had given him the chance to become something other than the monster he had been turning himself into for decades. The device beneath his desk had been meant to end his life, but its discovery had instead marked the beginning of a transformation that would echo through years of changed decisions and redirected purposes. In the end, Viktor Antonov learned that the most unexpected teachers often come in the smallest packages, and that the courage to accept mercy when it is offered can be just as transformative as the courage to offer it to others. The boy who had whispered about something under the desk would never know the full impact of his innocent observation, would never understand how his simple words had rippled outward through time to touch countless lives and redirect the flow of power and violence in an entire city. But perhaps that was as it should be, Victor thought. The greatest gifts are often given without awareness of their value, and the most profound changes begin with the smallest moments of unexpected connection between strangers who might otherwise have passed through each other's lives without leaving any trace at all. A Maid Toddler had saved a Mafia boss's life, and in doing so, had saved something far more important than the man himself. He had saved the possibility that even in the darkest corners of the human heart, light could still find a way to enter and transform everything it touched. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful and emotional stories like this, make sure to asterisk like this video and subscribe to the channel asterisk asterisk. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in their place? Your support helps us bring you more unforgettable stories. See you in the next one.